Welcome to another episode of The Local Dive. This is Alex Scott, joined by Dean and Sarah, Ashlyn Portero.
Hello.
Jacob
What's
Baldry.
up? Hello.
How's everybody doing? There it is.
Jacob's back from the beach.
Back from the beach.
Zach was a rough guest host, so it's good to have Jacob back.
He is. You've just now given Zach a complex.
Well, it was like emergency to get him back here after Zach's performance last week. So
Oh my god.
it's good to have you back from the beach.
He's in a long sleeve beach T-shirt, trying to make sure that
he went to St. George Island and bought a shirt that said St. George Island.
I bought two actually.
at
We're not
least
talking about going to London and
He's
getting
been there,
shirts.
done that, got the T-shirt.
Not going to Sydney, Australia to get a shirt.
At least
St.
he's
George Island.
not wearing the shirt on St. George Island.
That'd be true.
That would be weirder. So rock it.
You ever do that? Have you ever accidentally worn a shirt to the place? Like a Kush's shirt to Kush's?
Yeah, I did it, but it was the Royal Scoop. I went, I used to work there. I just had an
Ice
old
cream
work
place
shirt.
in Fort Myers for
Yeah, it's different
listeners.
if you work there.
Yeah, but I hadn't worked there in
called
2
your
years.
uniform.
Oh, yeah. I
No,
was
no,
like,
no,
yeah, Alex, that sounds pretty required.
I hadn't worked there in 2 years, and then I
Okay.
just happened to show up, and I was like, well, this is weird. But then I got 15% off for wearing a shirt, so I was like,
nice.
it worked out.
My goal in life is a Chick-fil-A polo. One of my main goals in life, to have my own Chick-fil-A polo to be able to wear to Chick-fil-A.
I have a feeling that probably is possible. Maybe not.
That'd be
but-
hardcore about the dress code for
Yeah.
because it's such a well-run company. It might be pretty strict about who gets the polos and who doesn't.
That's true. That's fair. I don't know. We'll have to see. Maybe we can make that happen. But all right. Well, we are going to jump into our episode this week. We'll kind of return from kiddie pool form last week where it was all shallow and actually dive in to the deep end in a little bit. But before we do, there's a famous phrase. I don't know if famous is the right word, but a common, when something happens and then there's a leader or a person or a thing that is, kind of rising to the occasion. And a common phrase is, thank goodness for so-and-so. They were brought out to lead for such a time as this. And so we want to have a little fun with that and say, what are some things that in culture are for such a time as this? So what do you got?
Okay, I have mine written down on a little napkin that I will read. Yeah, so mine are more like these things have already risen up, I feel like.
Sure.
They had their Esther moment within the last year or so. So in the midst of coronavirus in 2020, I would say memes rose up and had their for such a time as this. They were there for us.
I think they continue to be there for us.
How many memes during lockdown do we send to each other per day?
I mean, I literally, I think, had to clean out space on my computer and my phone
They
to
were for
make
such a
room.
time as this. They
Yes,
were.
It was
Yes.
excellent.
Epidemiologist. I feel like if you're an epidemiologist, you're like, it's my moment. Like,
That's true.
I'm
Job security.
right. I would say homebodies. For such a time as this, homebodies, people who like to, be at home and embrace that. I would say Amish culture or maybe just Amish Mennonite culture in general, because let's talk about the many things that rose up and infiltrated our culture.
In the current, run on gas, Amish culture really was made for such a time as
there
this.
you go. And also I would say bread making had its moment.
It did.
Women's prairie style dresses really had a big moment. That might moment still be going on. But as a person who's 5 feet tall and doesn't look great in overwhelming prints, I didn't partake in that trend. But, so there's lots of things that for a while, none of us could get haircuts. So, it's just kind of a revert to
Down home on the range.
the olden days. Yeah. And then athleisure. I feel like elastic waistbands, really, it's just for such a time as this, they were made. And
Quarantine 15.
yoga pants, we all embraced them full force. So yes, those are my Esther moments of the last year or so.
I
Yeah,
feel
that
like
was
I
a
can't
very
even
good
go
list.
now.
No, I know.
It's strong.
Well, so one thing I'll add to it because I feel like streaming services, so Netflix,
yes.
Disney Plus, whatever else people want, Hulu, I guess, Amazon Prime. It's I can't go anywhere. Because Netflix was around. It was a thing before
Right.
COVID, but it was definitely
Yeah,
got
our movie theater is gonna come back.
I don't know.
I don't go to movies. My attention span doesn't last long enough. I can't sit through the whole thing. Football games have commercials on TV
There you go.
instead of baseball
Yeah.
games.
What do you got on for such a time as this?
My for such a time as this, as you know, I am someone who believed it was not like some kind of hoax thing, like believed that the coronavirus should be taken seriously.
Yeah.
But was very troubled by the optics and the double standards and the drama, the over drama of it. I've been consistent on that since day one, while still believing that we need to be careful on vulnerable people and all those kind of things. So those disclaimers. My Such a Time as This is Clay Travis's Twitter feed. Because Clay Travis, you know the old phrase, other people say keeping it real anymore. I think it's kind of a dated phrase. He kept it real on so many things.
Did.
And who is Clay Travis for our listeners?
Clay Travis, he has a company called Outkick. He actually sold it to Fox for like $1 gajillion. He's out of Nashville, and he's always been sports.
Okay.
And he's actually has always been politically liberal, but like between like crazy, like far extreme wokeness, and also unrelated, but maybe sometimes cousins, the COVID, like major Corona people, like Corona Bros. He coined the phrase Corona Bros.
Okay. Gotcha.
And he just like kept he shared like data every day that wasn't politically driven, like because he doesn't identify as a conservative or anything like that. So he just like really kind of kept it real every day about just the things that were real and the things that were just ridiculous.
Gotcha.
And that just kind of kept me sane. I needed somebody to say out loud what I was thinking and hoping the entire time. So that's definitely for me. And another one for such a time as this, I'm going to go with Starbucks mobile orders.
Oh, good one.
Because Starbucks is still closed for indoor seating. Of course, it's Starbucks. It's based out of Seattle. But mobile orders, I mean, I go, including Christmas Day, I get Starbucks every single day of the year, 365 days a year, including when I go to London, and I've gotten it there even. I don't miss a day, Thanksgiving and Christmas included. And thankfully, I was still able to do that even during the lockdowns because of such a time as this for the mobile orders to be in existence. So I'm very, very thankful for that. And I would also say just the existence in general, I'm stealing here, just of fun things on the internet. I'm stealing yours. Like just like from memes to just video clips to parodies to like, it just is great.
We all found a way to make ourselves laugh.
Yes, and a lot of it. There's just some good. Also, for like as contested as the election was, back in November, like that was really just a breath of fresh air to have funny things.
Yeah.
Like I think you can't survive this world anymore mentally if you take yourself too seriously.
Totally.
So those kind of things, you can make fun of yourself.
Is
make
there
fun
a book
of culture.
about that?
Oh, getting over yourself. Yeah, that's a little bit of it, but we just can't, and so I think those things just help us to keep things in check a little bit and be able to laugh at ourselves. I mean, Babylon Bee still cracks me up. I know that's kind of like almost kind of not as fresh as it used to be. That's hilarious to me. You just can just make fun of things, and there's just so much. I mean, anything from like John Chris videos are always helpful. Just all those kind of things. I'm just thankful for random internet fun.
I will say this is sort of in the line of the Starbucks app, but I'm a big fan of like grocery store pickup and not having to go like Target pickup's the best because you can just have like one item and I no longer have to run in. I can just like click I'm here and then they bring it out to the car and it's like this is pretty sweet. And it was really good when we had COVID and like needed stuff because then I was like, here, open my trunk. Like you can just put it in there. I don't even have to deal with, I just show you the little code and it's good to go. So I'm pro that. If I could continue shopping that way, I would.
And since I'm the kind of person that goes the same like 4 places and knows everyone who works there inside the restaurant or inside the store, like pickup order is painful for me. So mobile order, at least let me get inside. Be able to say, yeah. Like I like rarely, y'all know me, y'all are with me all the time. I rarely go through drive-thrus. I want to walk in. Like I went through drive-thru today with y'all because it was raining and we were just kind of in a hurry. And I still got to talk to all my people though.
You did
inside, yeah.
You did.
So
you recognized that there was a girl who was new. Like it was like,
yeah. I yelled out, "Is she new?" And they were like, "Actually, yes."
Yeah, she's training. That's whoever it was. So
that's my people.
Yeah. So anything, Jacob? Do you have anything that you felt like rose to the occasion? And
the only thing I can think of is those who invested in Zoom.
Oh yeah.
I wish I did that.
True.
Yeah.
Man.
Oh, Peloton too. Like
that really was a thing.
And like home
Yes,
workouts
home
and
workouts
stuff.
for
Talk about perfect timing for Peloton.
Yeah.
I mean, like perfect timing.
They just had like a huge recall of treadmills. So
Why? Could you like fall on it or something?
I think actually like this kind of, it's
Like
really
catch
sad.
on fire?
No, somebody died on one of them, not like from exercise, it was like a kid got caught in it or something. It was
Oh,
really
gosh.
terrible. Yeah, but they had a huge recall, so not awesome. But home workout, we'll say, had a
And remember,
its moment.
and to give credit where credit is due to the best company in the United States of America, Chick-fil-A in Tallahassee never closed
never.
the entire time.
That's true.
That they weren't allowed to have the dining room open.
Yeah.
But they were in business the entire time.
And killing it like usual.
No doubt.
So, all right. Well,
Such a time as this.
yeah.
Truett Cathy's legacy.
Thank the Lord for all of those things and that they were there to serve us for such a time as this.
Such a time as this.
Speaking of,
Hey.
as we head into the deep dive, and we are going to sort of spend a little bit of today introing kind of the next 5 weeks ahead, and also recapping the sermon that Dean, you preached on Sunday as we continued, or this past Sunday. It'll be 2 Sundays from when this comes out, but was as we continued to preach through the Bible in a year, and we through this series that we've been calling The Whole Story in the book of Esther, where we were on Mother's Day. So we're going to talk about God's sovereignty in salvation, and then that'll be kind of today's topic, and then thinking through some sort of doctrinal implications and God's purposes of grace in salvation over the next weeks ahead. And so hopefully this will be a helpful and enjoyable and stimulating discussion as we dive in. So can you maybe start and give like a sermonette clip of kind of where you know, a high level overview of what you preached on Sunday?
Yeah, so Esther it's a book in the Bible where God's name is not mentioned. That obviously sounds very strange to have a book of the Bible where there's no God, there's no Lord. I mean, there's no even like other name for God. Like, it's just not there. And as you read and understand the story, you see that this is actually an intentional omission, because God's hand is all over the book. I mean, everywhere. And the story of Esther is God continuing to position his people, even when they weren't even being faithful, in the right places at the right time to continue his work of saving a people for himself, ultimately carried out into the line of the Messiah to Christ. So it's just such a neat story of what looked like complete dire circumstances and God completely flipping the script, I mean, over and over again in this story, to allow his promise to continue and to show that no human plans, even the most powerful human plans of the day, can stop it for even a second. So it's just a neat story of God using Esther, of God using Mordecai, of even God using, you know, the king who was not a believer, God even using Haman, who was evil, like using these people for his glory and salvation for his people. And it became, I mean, I'm a pastor, so hopefully, like, I know the books of the Bible, like I went to school for this, right? But I hope, but at the same time, like you don't camp everywhere, right? Like, you're not an expert on every book of the Bible just because you're a pastor. If you're a doctor, you're not an expert on every single surgery and every single, you know, you have like kind of your things, right? So even like someone who's a primary care guy, like he's the good overview. But for if you need someone specialist, you're going to get sent to somebody who specializes in it. So Esther for me is kind of like that. Like, I know the book, I can tell you the story quickly, but I never really camped in it or studied it or preached from it or anything like that. And through the preparation from this book, it has become my favorite book in the Old Testament. And I just love the story. It's incredible because it points us to God's sovereignty, which is our great hope, right?
Mm-hmm. So as we think about that, and really God's sovereignty in salvation, right, that there is, you know, he, like, ultimately God is going to save his people. He's like, the plan that he is working out is going to come to fruition. How, like, what is a sort of baseline definition, just so that we're all kind of talking about the same thing and meaning the same thing when we say sovereignty? What do we, like, in terms of salvation, what do we mean by God's sovereignty in salvation?
To me, when I think of God's sovereignty over salvation, I think of his, not just his foreknowledge. It's easy just to think of that word, but his actual intentional acting, overseeing and carrying out his purposes. That it's not just like, oh, he sees before. Yes, he does see before, but he also makes it before. Like, he's all of those things. Like, he actually, the old song we sang when we were kids is so right. He's got the whole world in his hands. Remember that song? Yeah, like every little kid knows that song, at least back when I was a kid. Mm-hmm. That times 10. Like he, not just the world, but like the people and his plan and history, and that all of it is not just foreseen, it's orchestrated by God. That's what comes to my mind when I think of big picture sovereignty.
What would you say, are there any differences, or what are the distinctions between sovereignty and providence? Like if somebody is kind of thinking, okay, God is sovereign, we see God's providence at work, like what are some of the nuances, or do we think about those, in similar terms? Like how do each of those words maybe bring out different aspects of God's character?
Okay, so John Piper's book, Providence, that just came out in the last few months. There's over 700 pages on the topic of providence. And I'm working through it right now. And the beginning of the book is really trying to solve that. Like he really talks about it. That's actually, he brings that up. So he says, hey, in providence, I'm not just talking about God's sovereignty. I'm talking about more than that. So providence comes from the makings up of the Latin words pro video, to see before. So, pro before, video to see, which is kind of cool. That's why Latin, even though it's a dead language, is pretty helpful for English understanding. So he would say that not only is God seen before, that he's actually bringing these things to be in his providence. So I think those things are pretty linked together, the two words. But sovereignty, I would say, is almost like the umbrella. Okay. And providence is like the working out of it.
Maybe kind of, because like when I think of sovereignty, even thinking about like an earthly king or ruler, you sort of think of like power, ruling and reigning. And so could you kind of think of it that way, where there's God's sovereignty, and then like to your point, the providence is sort of the outworking of like God is ruling and reigning as God. And in that sense, we can look at him as not like us in that way, that God is sovereign and we are not. He has a different kind of power than we have. And so that, to me, that kind of ascribes, not like usness to God.
Definitely, yeah.
But then providence might be, to your point, the seeing of it. And so there's like God's wisdom in orchestrating the things that he does. Because is that how you could kind of make that distinction?
I think so. And I when you were making that statement, I was thinking of Romans 8. So in Romans 8:29, that those he foreknew, he predestined to be conformed to the likeness of his son. So you see that foreknowledge there. So you see the rule. You also see in 8:28, he's working all things together. So those things are taking place. And then there's the action of what he's doing. So those he foreknew, he predestined, which is an action, to be conformed, like for a purpose. So you see those things all working. But the sovereignty part is the one that he reigns, he rules, right? He's working things together. He's the only one who can do that. We can't work things together for our good. He does. But the sovereignty, the providence, so the word provideo is used in that text. The foreknew. I believe, I preached a sermon on it forever ago, and I'm trying to remember. I have my notes in front of me with that word, but those he foreknew, he predestined to be conformed. Yeah, so that's provideo. That providence is in there. Okay. So he's seen these things before and causing them to happen.
When Ashlyn, as you were talking about, the sort of like not like usness of God and his sovereignty, that made me think about, like, if we think about in the context of salvation, like in a sense, we don't have the power that God has in his sovereignty, like in his as reigning kind of ruler, to save ourselves. Like, so right. We actually, in the context of this discussion of salvation, we need to we need God's power to save us, and then it's through his providence that we are saved, would be sort of how I think about that, and as we've had this discussion. So, Dean, one of the things that I just think this could be interesting and may take us a couple different places, but in this idea that, and you talked about this on Sunday in your sermon, but that there are oftentimes, like in our own stories and our own salvation, like there's sort of two camps: people who say this is undoubtedly, like with, no question, God's handprints are all over kind of my salvation and my story. And then there are other people who go, this is all just kind of a big coincidence that this happened and this happened and then this happened. And really, like, I think if we look at our stories, we can see the Lord's hand in kind of at work in all of our lives and all of our salvation. And so I thought it could be interesting just maybe for us to share some, and how we, as we think back about our own salvation and how we see kind of the Lord's just so happens like to just so happen to move here, or just so happen to go to this school, or I just so happen to do whatever. What are the ways that maybe we see the Lord's sovereignty in our kind of salvation and life and ministry?
Yeah, there might be coincidences in the random things of life, but there, are not coincidences when it comes to God's sovereignty in terms of salvation for his people. And I believe that with all my heart. Esther, it just so happened that the king's wife did not want to come down and be paraded around. And it just so happened that he was such a slime ball that he then divorced her and made her not the queen anymore. And it just so happened that Esther happened to be Jewish and happened to be beautiful and was noticed and was made the queen. And it just so happened that that Mordecai would overhear a plot to kill the king, and that he would report it, and it would be recorded in the king's chronicles. And we just keep going. It's like just so happened. Really?
Mm-hmm.
All these things are, and the king would would have his chronicles read to him and be reminded of Mordecai, what Mordecai did for him, and that the gallows that were going to be used to kill Mordecai for not bowing down to Haman would become the same ones that they would use to kill Haman for wanting to kill the Jews. Are you kidding me? It just
so happens.
Yeah, so you're talking about just like my own story, like I think I told our church this on Sunday. I said, for my own personal story, and this sounds at first like you're trying to make it all about you, but no, it's all about God and what God's done in all of our lives. So it just so happened, that my dad's high school track coach in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, would get the assistant superintendent job in Tallahassee in the late 80s. And then in 1990, they would open a new middle school called Deer Lake Middle School. And he would call my dad, who he knew wanted to get out of South Florida, but needed to stay in state because he already put in probably a decade worth plus of retirement at the time into the state system. And then my dad with my family would move here to Tallahassee. And from there, that same middle school my dad would go to open that I would go to, and that I would get invited to the Fellowship of Christian Athletes by a classmate, and maybe even more than that, maybe that my family would grow up loving sports. So when I heard athlete, I wanted to go. I didn't think it was weird at all. And from there, I'd hear the gospel for the first time and believe the good news. And then how God's used this church. And then this same city I moved to, that same year, the exact same year that I became a believer and heard the gospel, that I would play on the same baseball team as a guy named Scott Simmons, whose family had just moved here from Chipley to Tallahassee. And that one day we would start a church together. It's incredible. And he was a believer and I was a believer. We didn't really talk about all that kind of stuff at the time. We were young and we didn't really know. We were just playing baseball. It wasn't like an avenue to do that. We'd go to the game and you'd play your game. We didn't drive and you'd go home. We were 13 years old. But God's doing this stuff. Mm-hmm. I'd see my brother and sister get saved as a result of that. And now it's just, and now my kids they have to make their own decision. But Tommy's, been baptized, made a choice to follow Christ. I'm hoping Ty's soon, in the Sally Asheville one day. Hopefully my family. All these are results of this, And Christy has her own story, of how she was positioned, I'm sure, and how when she came to faith, and that her parents would be at the church they were at in Fort Lauderdale, First Baptist Church, with very faithful preaching from O.S. Hawkins, who was the pastor at the time, and that they would happen to go there. Just like all these things, right? They all just the coincidence. It's just crazy to think that.
Mm-hmm. Ashton, what about you? Do you have kind of some of those moments as you think about your own story that you can go, yeah, this is clearly the Lord working?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I would say for me, Tallahassee has always been a home base for my family. We moved around a lot when I was growing up, but my parents met here and were married here, and my mom lived here her whole life. And so, we would move away, and then, we've moved back, and then we moved away from my dad's job. We kind of bounced all around. But I can see how Tallahassee is very central, I think, in terms of God working in my life. Because my grandparents were believers and they were very invested in their church. And so that was really, my family, we would go to church, but, we weren't always consistent growing up. And so really a lot of my exposure to, to truth, but to learning about who God is and how he works, came through having enough rootedness in my family and an extended family to kind of be exposed to truth over time. And then, staying here after college, it was actually something that, I wasn't planning on doing, but being rooted for a time after having moved around a lot, I think the Lord used, I mean, again, I didn't even plan on coming to FSU. I wanted to go somewhere else, and then just through a series of events ended up back here. And so I can see God's providence and constantly like bringing me back to Tallahassee for for purposes, multiple purposes that are some tied to salvation and others just continued growth and sanctification over time. And then of course, coming on staff at City Church and walking into a path of ministry. And so I can see lots of ways that the Lord has used a place in my life. But something else too that I think about when I was a kid, I would go to summer camp. It was GA camp, Girls in Action. It's like super Baptist, but which is funny because like my family was not like hardcore church family, but because of my grandparents, mostly I would go with my cousin to GA camp. And one of the things that I can look back on now and see where God was planting seeds for something specific. One of the things that you learn a lot about at GA camp is missionaries, and and they would bring in missionaries, and that was a big purpose of the camp, was to kind of expose you to like global missions and what God was doing in the world, and you learn about different cultures. You kind of have these like little as much of an immersive experience as you can create in like Lake Yale, Florida. It's at a camp.
Which is like the worst.
Right.
Like the most,
I mean,
if any place needs a facelift.
Oh. Yes.
Stan Darling's favorite place.
It's true, it is.
So, and so even then, and like then through involvement in church, and getting to learn about the lives of missionaries, and that was my grandmother did a lot with the WMU, if you want to get real hardcore Baptist, and she did a lot with kind of international ministry at First Baptist. And so there's like this legacy in my family of kind of that exposed me to that over time, and I can see how now that's something that I get really excited about, and have had the opportunity to help lead some of these things in our church as we become a sending church and send people and care for missionaries. And so just to see those things that I didn't just all of a sudden take an interest in. Again, I know I'm moving beyond salvation here, but I in my Christian life, I didn't just, randomly take an interest, even though every Christian should. I mean, it's biblical to care about world missions, but I see a lot of God's providence in the people that he put in my life and the experiences he gave me to really, burden me and give me a heart for wanting to see, people be sent and to see the gospel go forward around the world. And so those are just, a couple of things I can think of.
Well, that's God working on his sovereignty too for other people's salvation,
Yeah.
right? Your heart for missions, how your hands all over are sending, our care for missionaries. Our missionaries are in places where the gospel's not been heard.
Yeah.
It's just crazy. I think about, how the Lord, I think God works away for his church too, to carry out his mission.
Mm-hmm.
I think about Scott and I meeting, like, there's no way this church would have started without Scott Simmons.
Mm-hmm.
The amount of people who have been saved in this church and come to like God orchestrated that relationship. How crazy that I think way back like that I would be friends with, I would meet Corey Dortch in 7th grade, whose dad was a pastor for a long time at First Baptist Church, and one of my mentors, one of my favorite people on earth. And from there, that would allow me to be his intern, which would also have him to call me on the phone and ask me to come back and be their youth minister, get me back to Tallahassee. The relationships I would build there. Their church helped us get started financially.
Mm-hmm.
I became the youth minister to Sarah and Rebecca Fernald, who are Ashland's first cousins.
Yeah.
And that's how I met you.
That's how we met, yeah.
I mean, it's just incredible. And now here we are. You've been on the staff for a decade, longer, whatever it's been. It's just incredible how God just weaves all these things together for his mission. I'm sure churches across Tallahassee have all kinds of stories like that.
Oh, yeah.
And across the world. Like, that's what God does. Like, sovereignty, I think, puts people together, too, to carry out his purposes. I mean, like, I don't think it's a coincidence, Alex, that he put you on I-75 North to come to college and go to FSU.
Yeah, not at all.
Yeah, tell your story.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, it was one of those things where, like, as a senior in high school, I was really late in applying for colleges, mostly because there was just a lot of stuff going on with my family. And I was like, am I going to go to college? Am I going to do kind of like just go get into a vocation? And so I was thinking about going to be a firefighter EMT and just doing that and skipping college, and had a guidance counselor. I think my mom probably called her and then told her, like, hey, he's thinking about not going to college and I really want him to go. Can you, like, talk him out of it? And she kind of did. And so there was a girl I was dating, and I was like, well, she applied to FSU. I guess I'll apply to FSU too. And if I don't get in there, then I'll go to FGCU because I know I can. So I applied to FSU. I came up here, had really no intention of staying here. And I mean, I think like to go back, like the Lord really in a lot of ways had worked. I mean, I was a believer. I was kind of in a season where I wasn't like actively following the Lord or, walking with the Lord closely, but not, I don't know, but I had a foundation of the importance of the local church. I had really a great youth pastor growing up. I had a great senior pastor in kind of my most formative years as a teenager in the church. And so the local church became, it had been ingrained in me really through my parents taking me all the time to go to church and to be at church and to be a part of a church and
Pat Scott,
to value church community and to be involved even on days where I didn't want to get up as a 13-year-old and, go to church. It was like, no, we're going, get in the car. And so when I got connected to City Church like that, it was a natural thing for me to do that. And then to see just the way the Lord has continued to kind of, he used, I think, seasons in my life to draw me back to him and to kind of reignite my heart for the things of the Lord. And so, 100%. And then I think about like Melissa and I and our relationship and the things that we've both walked through in terms of kind of difficult things that have allowed, kind of us to understand sort of, family dynamics that are complex and complicated and things. And all of it is not things you would necessarily wish on somebody, but you can see the Lord's hand at work in all of it. And so I think all of those things, kind of play into the way the Lord, like if you look back, you're like, yep. That was in the moment, you can't see it all. But you can look back and easily go, the Lord is clearly, at work here. And
he's sovereignly working out his plans for his people in First Church. Mm-hmm. And so Esther is not just this isolated story, right? It's a story God wants us to know clearly. And I think to show us that this is not coincidental.
No.
Like he is working, and like, I think every Christian, I love for every listener to like think about it for a minute. Like, hey, how is God, we're not even talking about fatalists here. Fatalist is somebody who falls down the stairs and say, God, thank you, that's over, kind of thing. And so that's what Jerry Falwell used to say when I was in college at Liberty. But God's has worked out the details in your life to bring you to himself.
Mm-hmm.
Like he is, that's what it means salvation. We were called to salvation.
Yeah.
Right. And our calling takes different shapes and forms, but it's God drawing us and bringing us to himself.
So also thinking about the idea or the reality of God's sovereignty, all of Scripture helps us see different glimpses of who God is and of his character. And I think something that can be difficult to process sometimes as we're reading the Bible is, just this reality that God obviously in exercising his sovereignty and his providence, works through fallen, sinful people, and is able to orchestrate a lot of corruption and a lot of things that go really wrong still for his purposes. And so there's such a theme of ruling in Esther, as you see the different dynamics between the king and Queen Vashti and then Esther and then Mordecai and Haman, like you see all these people who are kind of like taking their, their place in ruling in some form or fashion. And so what would you guys say as we look at the idea of, different glimpses of human sovereignty in Esther? What does that tell us, maybe through those different people? What glimpses of God's power, God's rule, God's sovereignty do we see through the different characters of Esther? The story of Esther.
That's great. Yeah. I think from just human ruling sovereignty and how God works in that, I think about the king, that happened to be that king, who would happen to choose Esther. And again, Esther's never painted as a moral example.
Right.
You never hear it, but you never hear Esther talked about being godly. Mm-hmm. Basically she's called beautiful. Right. And that she's here for a reason. And that God wants to use her. I think of the fact that I really think that Vashti's unwillingness, I don't know if it was stubbornness at the time or just being over it, or her and the king got in a fight before, or she's just tired of being paraded around like she was some kind of prop or something, and her decision to not do that. I see these like just human elements, these human decisions, these human leadership decisions and rulings that I think that Haman, I see Haman, I think he's really a kind of tangible example of the forces of evil, mm-hmm. the demonic, the people who are against God, the Canaanites. He was a Canaanite descent ultimately. And here he is asking everyone to bow down, right? That is the message of the world, right? Where you can bow down to the world or bow down to the Lord. It's going to be, it's a golden calf. Mm-hmm. It's a living example, a human example of a golden calf. Bow down to this instead of God. And Mordecai says no. That's a foundational moment in that book, mm-hmm. because he, at that moment, finally realized that who he really was. And as a human being, he remembered that he was one of God's people.
Mm-hmm.
And that decision, just that, no, I'm not going to bow down decision, changed the entire course of the book, the whole course. And then you start to see, God's people are remembering for a minute that they're God's people.
Right.
And that's a game changer.
Mm-hmm.
So that's to me, that Haman character and that Haman Mordecai moment. Worship me, no. Oh boy. That's the game changer. And then when Mordecai tells Esther, hey, you need to tell the king either but if not, another deliverer is going to come.
Mm-hmm.
Someone else is going to deliver us. He doesn't tell us who it is, but we say, somebody knows God's promises. He's been informed of this. He's been taught this. He's been told this, even though he's been in exile. Somewhere down the line, he had some kind of knowledge of his roots and how those roots are theistic and not just a random generic theistic, but the living God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who's going to redeem people for himself. So that's why I think God's sovereignty and salvation is so important for us to grasp, because I don't know how the Old Testament makes sense without it. Because here's God's like unapologetically, unconditionally, and distinctly having a people, not an everybody, a people that he would redeem for himself, and that he is relentlessly carrying out that plan, even through very flawed human people, even through people that, so a lot of times we'll see flawed people, but they're at least his people, right? He's using the king, the Persian king, who's not his people.
Right.
He's using him to carry out his plans and ruling and reigning for his. And so that just, when you said that, all those things kind of popped in my mind thinking through the book.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, just to quickly bounce off of that, I think there is kind of this current running through Esther where there's the question of who is going to be worshiped and who is going to be protected and redeemed. And is man going to be worshiped and man's purposes are going to be protected and upheld or glorified, or is, and ultimately we see, God's going to be worshipped and his people are going to be protected and his his plans are going to persist to redeem a people for himself. And so, because even when you see the Jews are given permission to defend themselves, and so I think that's just something that, as I look at like a high level view of Esther, it's kind of this question of like who will ultimately reign and rule, and of course we know it's God.
I want to write a commentary on Esther.
That'd be awesome.
That's just a random announcement, but I'm not tomorrow, about a couple more projects before then. But when I've never written a commentary before. I've only written 2.5 books, but without a doubt, it's kind of a pamphlet. But down the road, I'm like, what are things out there that I think the church could use? I think of our church first, before I think of anything else. That's why I write for first, is our own church. That's my first responsibility. But Esther, I mean, what a book! I mean, this conversation we're having right now. I mean, it's incredible. It's such a what a story.
Well, and I think one of the things that as we think about as a church, like both the idea that we're spending time in the scriptures this year, and I mean, obviously every year, but like intentionally walking through the scriptures, and then the parallel that you just made with Mordecai remembering who he was, and he had been in exile. He knew he was one of God's people, and there were things that had been passed down. And so what came to mind, and I don't know, this is maybe an open-ended question, but what is the value and the importance? And even Dean, you said like reading kind of the Old Testament in the context of Christ and having understanding that God had a chosen people. Like, how important is it for the Christian to know the scriptures, to see the storylines, to see God's faithfulness over and over and over again, to connect the dots, to really, in those moments where we are faced as Christians with this idea of, are we going to bow down to Haman, or are we going to bow down to the Lord? Like, where does our worship go? How important is it for us to know these stories and know the scriptures and know the full counsel of God, so that we can have those sort of moments of like, oh, wait, I don't belong to you, the world. I belong to this other world. Like,
yeah, I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, over and over and over again. Right? He repeats that. And people talk, something that some folks complain about with gospel centrality and preaching, they don't fully understand it. It's just kind of the same thing every week, right? It just kind of feels like it's the same. It's like, yes, but like in different aspects. It's not a coincidence that every stinking time God is before his people. That's what he tells them, right? I am the Lord your God. I brought you out of Egypt. See that reminder, and that's the call to faithfulness, because if he's God, then other things aren't God. And he won't share his glory with another. And part of the Egypt story is him tearing down the Egyptian empire and the Egyptian idols and the paganism, and to protect the people for himself. And I think just us understanding God's sovereignty in our salvation, in our deliverance, in our redemption, is really important for us to understand grace. Those Hebrew people did nothing to earn that. They're not better than the Egyptians.
Right.
They're not.
No, that was very clear in the Exodus.
Yeah, they proved it.
Yeah.
Right?
Which I'm like, that totally would have been me.
Oh, same.
I would have been the person who's like, I'm really thirsty.
Yeah, I'd have complained about the manna the whole time. Yeah, I'd ask for like no pickles and and like,
Can I be a little crispier today, please?
My manna with no pickles, please.
Yes, please.
And Chick-fil-A sauce.
Yes. So I think that it's a story of grace, and we have to understand salvation as a story of grace. And it's interesting to me how people struggle with that. Like, they don't want to believe that it's all God. It's like, well, does that just make us robots? It's like, no, it makes us 100,000% dependent upon the Lord for our deliverance, right? Yeah, and if we were robots, I'm okay with that too, because God's still God, right? But we're not robots. We're called to respond in faithfulness and in repentance. But I mean, let's think about that's the time what Mordecai did, right? He that was his way of re-identifying himself with who he was and who God's people were and his role as that. But I want to err on the side that God's sovereignty is too big, not diminish it at all, because I think that's a storyline of the Bible.
Well, so I was listening to a podcast earlier today, and I had never heard someone really put it this way before, but they were talking about how Christian humility actually flows out of great Christian confidence in
Love that.
in God. And I did too. I thought that was really good because, I think for us today, it can be humbling to look back at, Alex, we were talking about, to sort of look back at the storyline of Scripture and understand how God is working through all of these different scenarios. I think it's good for us to see we have the luxury of looking back and saying, okay, if I study enough, and the Holy Spirit helps me to understand, but as I learn the Scriptures, I can see all these connections. I can start to see how God is at work in the world. But, I think about like what it was actually like to be Esther, from moment to moment, and just to be like truly depending on God's sovereignty, on the faithfulness and the promises of God, and for Mordecai to constantly remind her of that, and so I think when you think about it that way, we can see, God's hand in everything. And so we can have this great confidence that God is working things out, but then it also, like in an application way, gives us both confidence and humility in our own lives to say we may be in the middle of something where we don't see, we're in, the darkness of the world. We don't see how God could possibly be using certain things that are happening for his purposes. But then we can look back to the Scriptures as a testament that he is, look at the story of Esther. And so I really love that kind of picture of, great confidence in God actually leads us to great humility and trust as the people of God.
Amen. And I told our church on the Sunday we did Esther, which I guess was 2 Sundays ago when you hear this recording, was that I believe, this is my opinion, I believe that Romans 8:28 and 29, and really 30 and 31, you can kind of keep going with the rest of the chapter where it gets into nothing in separation from God's love, like around verse 35. I think that is like almost like I think Esther is a like plot story of that being worked out, like a true actual human story of us seeing Romans 8:28. So let's say the end of the chapter in the flesh, that God's working all things together for the good of those who love him, who are his people, right? That promise is not for everybody. Those who love God have been called according to his purpose. That matters too. Who were called? His people, to be his people. We know that, that God, those he foreknew, he predestined to be conformed to the likeness of Christ. Those he predestined, he called, he justified, he glorified. What are we to say about these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? He did not even spare his own son. A few verses later, what could separate us from the love of God? Can affliction? Can all these things that definitely Esther was experiencing? And Mordecai is going to be killed. The Jewish people are going to be wiped out. Yeah. He called for a genocide, is what the king called for. And then at the end of the story, Haman, the one who was going to execute, we're going to carry that out, is the one who gets killed instead. Mm-hmm. Whew. It's a
and
story.
You see great glimpses of God's justice.
Definitely. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely a story of justice. That's a good call.
Well, and one of the things I was looking back at in Esther, and it says Esther 9, it says these days are remembered and celebrated by every generation, family, province, and city, so that these days will not lose their significance in Jewish life, and their memory will not fade from their descendants. And I just think about that, like, Dean, you kind of charged everybody listening earlier to say, kind of look back at their own story and think of their like in a sense, their Esther story, right? Like in the way that the Lord has been working through their own lives and through, different influences and decisions and choices and all of those things that were made that the Lord used to save them and to save others through them and to, continue to sanctify them. And it's like, it's such an important reminder and call for us to remember these things, because we are tempted to forget. It's easy to forget, but to be able to look back and go, oh, that's how the Lord used this thing that in the moment, like when I was, being persecuted, or when I had this tragedy or this trauma or this thing, like that's when we can look back and go, oh no, that's how the Lord used that for my good. Like for me, that's part of that is my parents' divorce. Like in the moment, I could not see how the Lord was using my parents' divorce, which I'm not, I don't think was like,
and it wasn't good.
Yeah, it wasn't.
But
good.
God's working it.
But God's working,
yeah,
was working in it for my good and for His glory, and that continues to be seen. I think it's like you almost have to remember what He's done for Romans 8 to kind of look back for Romans 8 to come to life in a way that goes, oh, that's what that means. Not to go back to a couple weeks ago, not the pop Christianity, like kind of blessings on blessings on blessings working together for my good, but taking these things that man meant for evil that He's turned around and used for good.
To point us to Himself and to preserve and win a people for Himself.
Yeah.
And that preservation of a people, man, that's the story of the Old Testament. That's the story of the church now, right? We can't be taken out of the shepherd's hand, we're told in John 10. Like no one can snatch us from His hand. He who began a good work in us will be faithful to complete it. Esther's part of that story, and I also, let's not be mistaken that Esther also carried out a Joshua moment where he said, choose this day whom you will serve. And she had to be faced that reality. Like and like you're talking about, through the tragedies of life, through the things we don't understand where God is in this. And it's not crazy to ask the question, God, where are you in this? There's precedent of that. Read the Psalms. Yep. People are asking, where in the world are you? What is happening right now? But they still had to make a decision and choose this day who they're going to serve.
And I think in our cultural context too, it's important to remember that, Esther was not advocating for herself. She belonged to a people, and Mordecai was very faithful to remind her of that, that she was acting on behalf of God's people. And I think that can be something too that we can easily forget when understandably so, we are caught up in kind of our own personal challenges, to remember that God is not only just faithful to us, but to us as people who belong to the church. And so we're wrapped up in a much larger story of God's faithfulness, even outside of our own personal circumstances. And so, God was, kind to spare Esther, but also ultimately for the sake of His own glory and a people, as you said.
Everybody listening to this, please take some time today, tomorrow, over the weekend, and read through Esther.
Yeah.
Again, if you've already done it once after the service or around the time we were there, do it again. Just now that we've heard this conversation, doesn't take that long. Like just read it again. I love for you to read it with all the things we talked about in mind and just see such an incredible story of God's work.
Absolutely. Any final thoughts before we head into the local on tap?
I just really think we have to remember that God is faithful, and that's not a cliche. He is faithful to what He has sought out to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I really struggle with how controversial God's sovereignty over salvation is for a lot of Christians. Like, it really actually kind of bothers me, to be honest. And because what a glorious, like, it's the glory of God, right? Like it's showing God's glory just all over the place, and so why do we want it differently? Like, do we want to take a little bit of credit for it? Or are we that stubborn that we have to contribute something to our salvation? Is it a sentimental thing that we think that God just kind of threw out this random invitation and like He's hoping that everybody says yes? I mean, like, is that the God you really think is the God of the Bible that's sort of hoping for RSVPs? No, it's a God that's the great shepherd that's going out to get His sheep.
Yep.
And when
is
one,
leaving the 99.
heck yeah, to go get that one. He's not, doesn't want any of his people to perish, but all to come to repentance. And he's going to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And he's doing that as we speak. Like every time we see someone profess Christ in any church, in any cornfield, in any prison cell, any FCA meeting, anywhere around the world, it is God bringing his people to the plans that he had for them, which is to know him, to be won back to him. And I think sovereignty should cause us to worship, not to protest.
Yeah.
When it comes to salvation, and we're going to talk about that for the next 5-6 weeks.
I think that'll be something that we get to jump into as we kind of look at the doctrinal implications of God's grace in salvation. And I think one of the things, Dean, just to kind of continue on that point for just a minute, was, you said, like, do you want to, like, I don't really want to believe in a God who sends out an RSVP that might be answered. I want to worship the God of the God of the Bible, who is all powerful, who has a people who he is saving and has the power to redeem. Not just like, oh, maybe they'll come, to me. I don't know.
Yeah, we're the ones who are desperate, not him.
Right. Exactly.
And I hope it's that way.
Yeah.
What? I mean, that's.
And we'll get into this more, but like we need him.
The only thing I can think of is just that kind of sentimentality. It's that, well, my God and how I view God is this.
Yeah.
So we've kind of orchestrated this God of the Bible that looks more kind of like our grandfather that has some magic powers. And he's just a God that just loves, loves, loves. And the way we define love is like in that kind of grandfatherly kind of, it's not very salvation focused. It's not atonement focused. It's not judgment focused. I mean, all those things are aspects of God's love.
Yeah. And I think there's a struggle with people who they wrestle with the fact that God may not save all, doesn't save all, has the power to, but, and they think, well, and I think it's some of his short-sightedness too. It's like, well, they're not saved now. It's like, well, they might be saved 45 years from now. We don't know what God's purpose is in their, and his sovereignty and their salvation is. And so I think there's a temptation to struggle with that too. But that'll be all things we get to dive into over the next few weeks as we jump into this. So as we close with the local on tap and we think about Tallahassee and where we're on mission, we're going to go back to the beginning and have a For Such a Time as This local edition. So what are some things, let's just say in the last year and a half, whatever, that Tallahassee has offered for such a time as this? And I'm going to maybe say one before you steal it, and that's going to be the parks. Our beautiful, wonderful parks, as everybody explored the great outdoors for like 5 months last year.
So true. The greenways were here for us.
I think I walked Harriman Circle every single day for 4 months.
With a mask or...
No, because I was outside. Speaking of, for such a time as this, what Tallahassee has brought to the world is the resident of the governor's mansion, and I am thankful for that.
Yes.
Because I'm not some like really, really, really follow every policy kind of person. So I don't mean this is some kind of like that. I'm not saying that I agree with the governor on every single point of his life, because I don't know if I do or not. Okay, and all of his policies, I'm not really sure every plan he has, but I am thankful that he has shown leadership locally during this. And if you can't acknowledge just as a human the leadership that he has shown, maybe you're a little too political in how you view the world and can't view it rationally or honestly. So that's my rant. It was a little heavy for a local tap, but
it's true.
That's my such a time as this moment.
Quite local. I'll give it a hearty amen.
I'm really trying to think, what is having a local for such a time as this moment? I probably would have said Tallahassee's great parks, but I feel like there's got to be more, and I'm just having trouble coming up with something.
I would like to say I need it for such a time as this. Someone to stand in the gap for such a time as this and do something about North Monroe Street and the improvements that need to happen on the worst street in our city.
Actually, they just formed a task force or something.
I think I'm going to be on it, actually.
Oh. There you go.
I think I'm on it.
So you are the guy to fix what you just
dude, for such a time, I'm ready. For such a time as this.
All my recommendations.
Oh yeah, we're knocking everything down. Minus Culver's.
I was going to say, for such a time as this, Culver's.
Culver's. Just got a new Culver's Aussie.
So,
I haven't been yet because you got to wait a week in Tallahassee because of the hysteria of a new place.
Yep. I'll go.
But such a time as this. And you know what? I'm going to be a little sentimental here. Our church.
Yeah.
I think our church and just the encouragement of God's people being together during this time, to me, the kind of culmination of that was getting back to the Civic Center for Easter.
Yep.
Where it's
I
like,
was just
okay,
about to
guess
say
what?
that.
God's still working. That was never in question, even though in my head it was as a human being. God's still working. This church is still in his plans. There are still a people that want to be a part of it, and that a virus or fear or political climates and everything else is not going to keep people from that. And that was pretty important to me. That kind of moment.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, and I think also for such a time as this is God's people in general, all the Christians in the city who are not afraid to pursue unity, to not let politics divide them as friends, not to let racial tensions go to the point where it causes people to lose fellowship. I mean, I think we've seen a lot of that happen too. We've seen people that sadly have not been here for such a time as this and went the other direction. Mm-hmm. But with the amount of Christians I've seen that says, we're God's people, we're in this together. I think the church in Tallahassee is more unified than it's been in a long time. I'm seeing pastors generally rooting for each other. I think all those things are happening, and it's real. And also for such time as this is just a good Tallahassee bowl of chicken sausage gumbo akushas.
Preach.
Just want to throw it out there.
Anything else? Did anything come to mind?
No.
Jacob, you got anything?
I'm totally.
I don't.
Beach season?
Yeah, beach
for
season.
such a time as this.
I'll take that.
Keep those calves golden, baby.
That's right. Long sleeve T-shirt today to give him a little protection from comments about his guns.
Okay. We can't see his biceps, but we know they're there.
They're there.
Anyways, on that note, Jacob feels awkward, Ashlyn feels awkward, and we're going to wrap this thing up.
I'd like to give a shout out to our most faithful listener, Holly Tucker.
There you go. Thanks for listening. Share with a friend, leave a review, subscribe, like, 5 stars, all that. We'll see you next week as we dive into the doctrines of grace. See ya.
Thanks for listening to The Local Dive, a podcast diving into deep and shallow musings about Christ, the church, and culture. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. You can follow The Local Dive on social media and continue the conversation with us on Instagram and Twitter at The Local Dive Pod.